Arjun Varma, a dedicated Indian medical student, never imagined that his quiet determination to help patients would put him in the crosshairs of Deputy Kyle Reddick, a man with a hidden violent streak. What began as a simple observation of suspicious injuries quickly escalated into a deadly confrontation that shocked the entire county. Arjun Varma arrived in Florida carrying the hopes of his family and the weight of his own ambitions. He was quiet, observant, and determined to become the kind of doctor who made a real difference. The hospital where he began his clinical rotations was nothing like the medical colleges back home. It was busy, loud, and often chaotic, but Arjun adapted quickly. He volunteered for extra shifts, stayed late to assist senior physicians, and learned the routines of every department faster than anyone expected. His dedication made him well-liked, yet he remained mostly to himself. As weeks passed, Arjun started noticing unusual injuries on certain detainees brought in by law enforcement. The wounds were often deep, patterned, and older than the reports claimed. At first, he assumed they were isolated incidents or misunderstandings. But the same deputy brought in many of these patients, and something about the timing always felt off. The bruises seemed too similar, as if they came from the same source. Arjun wrote notes in a small notebook he kept in his backpack, not knowing whether he would ever use them. He didn't set out to expose anyone. His only intention was to document what didn't make sense, hoping clarity would come later. But the more he observed, the more uneasy he became. He sensed a hidden current beneath the hospital's atmosphere, a tension that others pretended not to notice. Some nurses avoided certain cases. Some doctors refused to question reports. Arjun felt as if everyone knew something he didn't. Despite his growing concerns, he continued working hard, believing that focusing on his studies would keep him grounded. But every shift added another puzzle piece to a picture he wasn't sure he wanted to see. Without realizing it, Arjun had stepped into a truth far more dangerous than he imagined. Deputy Kyle Reddick carried a reputation that followed him long before Arjun ever heard his name. In the county, people spoke about him in low voices, describing a man who smiled for official photos but changed the moment authority wasn't watching. He had a history of aggression complaints that never went anywhere, usually dismissed as misunderstandings or acts of necessary force. Most residents believed it was safer not to question anything involving him. Those who tried learned quickly that challenging a deputy could bring consequences no one wanted to face. Reddick's presence in the hospital was always tense. Nurses stiffened when they saw him, and younger staff members avoided eye contact. He walked with the confidence of someone who believed rules didn't apply to him. Whenever he brought in a detainee, he spoke in clipped summaries that left out key details. The injuries on the individuals he transported often didn't match the explanations he provided, yet no one pushed back. The county sheriff's office had a long-standing partnership with the hospital, and confronting a deputy could jeopardize careers. Arjun noticed the pattern almost immediately. Every few days, Reddick arrived with someone who seemed more beaten than arrested, yet the reports described routine apprehensions. The detainees rarely spoke, either too frightened or too injured. Arjun observed swelling that looked old, repeated wounds on the same areas of the body, and fractures that didn't align with the timeline. The similarities were too consistent to ignore. Instead of confusion, Reddick reacted with irritation whenever Arjun asked neutral medical questions, as if curiosity itself was a challenge. His eyes lingered a moment too long, holding an unspoken threat. Arjun sensed that Reddick was not merely a strict officer but a man hiding something violent beneath a calm exterior. Over time, the feeling grew stronger, forming a silent warning in Arjun's mind: this deputy was dangerous. And crossing his path could bring serious consequences. Arjun's days grew longer as his workload increased, and he often found himself assigned to late-night shifts when most of the hospital had quieted down. During these hours, he discovered a sense of calm that helped him think clearly. One evening, while completing a research task for Dr. Crane, he entered the hospital's records room, a windowless archive filled with shelves of old files and computer terminals used to access digital logs. The room smelled faintly of paper and dust, the kind of place where secrets could easily hide without anyone noticing. As Arjun reviewed patient histories for his assignment, he came across a familiar name, a detainee he had treated earlier that week with suspicious injuries. Out of curiosity, he cross-checked the medical report with the police intake file. The timelines didn't match. The injuries were described as recent, yet Arjun had clearly seen signs of older trauma. He pulled up another case involving the same deputy and noticed a similar inconsistency. At first, he wondered if he was misreading something. But the more files he opened, the more problems appeared. He created a private folder on his laptop and began copying down dates, injuries, officer names, and treatment notes. It wasn't a formal investigation, just an attempt to understand why things felt wrong. But with each new entry, Arjun realized the pattern was too strong to dismiss. The same deputy, the same type of injuries, the same gaps in documentation. The report seemed edited, as if someone wanted to make certain details disappear. The weight of the discovery pressed heavily on him. He wasn't sure who to tell or if anyone would believe him. Still, he couldn't ignore what he had found. Arjun left the records room that night with a quiet sense of dread, knowing he had uncovered the first layer of something far bigger than he expected. Arjun's growing unease became more noticeable to the people around him, even though he tried hard to hide it. He started moving differently, more carefully, more aware of who was watching. He locked his room door even during the day and kept his laptop close, never leaving it on a desk unattended. Liam, his roommate, noticed these changes and sensed that Arjun was carrying a burden heavier than his coursework. Arjun seemed distracted during conversations, often staring at the door as if expecting someone to walk in without warning. At the hospital, Dr. Melissa Crane observed Arjun's behavior with increasing curiosity. She respected his work ethic, but his sudden obsession with files and records raised questions she didn't know how to ask. One afternoon, she saw him printing documents he didn't need for their assigned tasks. She noticed the way he slipped papers into his bag as if afraid someone might see them. Concerned, she confided in a colleague in the administrative department, hoping they could quietly check whether Arjun was struggling with stress or making mistakes that required guidance. That colleague happened to share weekend tennis sessions with the county sheriff. Without thinking much of it, he mentioned that a student had been acting strangely and reviewing cases involving law enforcement. It seemed harmless to him, but the information traveled quickly and reached the wrong ears. Within a few days, whispers spread through the sheriff's office about a medical student collecting evidence. The mention was vague, yet specific enough for Deputy Kyle Reddick to recognize the situation. Reddick's awareness changed everything. The atmosphere around Arjun shifted in ways he couldn't quite explain. People who once smiled now watched him with stiff expressions. The hospital halls felt heavier, colder. Arjun didn't know it yet, but the moment his curiosity became known, he crossed an invisible line that placed him directly in danger. Deputy Reddick's interest in Arjun intensified the moment he heard that a student at the hospital had been looking into detainee injuries. He didn't know Arjun's name at first, but he recognized the description, a young foreign student who asked too many medical questions and looked too closely at bruises others ignored. Reddick began piecing together small details, remembering the times Arjun had paused while documenting injuries and the quiet suspicion in his eyes. The realization that someone might be connecting the dots made Reddick more alert, more calculating. Arjun, unaware that he had become a target, continued his routine with a mix of fear and determination. He knew the files he collected contained something important, though he still wasn't sure how far the problem extended. The tension he felt every time he walked through the hospital parking lot or down a dim hallway made him more cautious. He avoided shortcuts, checked over his shoulder, and started noticing unfamiliar cars parked near his building at night. Reddick, meanwhile, began following Arjun's movements with precision. He parked near the student housing complex under the pretense of patrol duties, learning the times Arjun left for the hospital and returned home. He observed his grocery trips, late-night study sessions at the library, and even the routes he chose when walking alone. His surveillance was subtle enough not to raise alarms but invasive enough to understand Arjun's patterns. Arjun sensed that something around him had shifted. The feeling of being watched became hard to ignore. He didn't know who or what was behind it, but the instinct to protect himself grew stronger. The night before he planned to submit his findings to the hospital board, he made a careful decision. He emailed a backup copy of the evidence to a journalist he had never met, using only a brief message. In his mind, it was a quiet act of protection. In reality, it was the step that ensured what followed could never be fully erased. On the night Arjun left the hospital after midnight, the weather had shifted into a slow, heavy storm. Rain fell in uneven sheets, tapping against the pavement and pooling beneath dim streetlights. The parking lot was nearly empty, with only a few cars scattered across the wide space. Most employees had already gone home, leaving the area quiet enough for every sound to echo. Arjun walked quickly, clutching his backpack close to protect the documents inside. His steps splashed through shallow puddles, and each movement felt sharper than usual, as if the air itself carried a warning. A patrol car was parked near the far end of the lot, its headlights dimmed but engine running. At first, Arjun didn't think much of it. Deputies often passed through the hospital grounds. But as he approached his car, the patrol vehicle rolled forward slowly, its tires moving deliberately across the wet pavement. The lights reflected off the rain, casting shifting shadows that made it hard to see inside. When the car stopped in front of him, Arjun froze without fully understanding why. Security cameras later captured only outlines. Arjun stepping backward, the deputy's broad silhouette emerging from the vehicle, and a sudden movement that disrupted the stillness of the storm. The cameras had no sound, but the rapid motion suggested fear, conflict, and violence compressed into seconds. Arjun fell to the ground shortly after the deputy reached him, his body collapsing in a way that revealed the force behind the encounter. Deputy Reddick later claimed that Arjun attacked him, insisting it was an act of self-defense. However, the injuries found during the examination told a different story: deep bruises, repeated impacts, and trauma inconsistent with Arjun initiating anything. The quiet parking lot became the stage for a deadly moment, and within minutes, Arjun's future was erased beneath the flickering lights and steady rainfall. The hours following Arjun's death moved with unsettling speed. Before hospital staff could process what had happened, the sheriff's office had already taken control of the scene. Deputies surrounded the parking lot, blocking entrances and diverting questioning eyes. A brief report was issued, labeling the incident as a case of self-defense involving an aggressive suspect. The wording was vague enough to discourage curiosity yet official enough to silence immediate concerns. Anyone who attempted to ask more was met with cold, rehearsed responses that revealed nothing. Inside the hospital, administrators issued quiet instructions to their teams. Staff were told not to discuss the incident, not to speculate, and not to share details with anyone outside authorized personnel. Nurses who had seen Arjun earlier that night exchanged tense glances but kept their thoughts to themselves. Some felt uneasy about the sudden restrictions, others feared the possible consequences of questioning them. The atmosphere shifted from shock to caution, as if everyone had been reminded of an invisible boundary they had always known existed. In the sheriff's department, the narrative was shaped even faster. Reports were rewritten to align with the self-defense claim. Timelines were adjusted, making it appear as though the deputy had no choice but to act. Any video footage from the parking lot that showed too much movement or too much force was quietly labeled corrupted or unusable. The few security guards who had been nearby were warned to avoid giving statements until the department had finalized its official version of events. Arjun's body was released to the medical examiner with minimal explanation. The underlying message was clear: the case was closed before it had even begun. The county officials hoped that, with enough control and silence, the incident would fade into background noise. What they did not realize was that Arjun's evidence had already traveled beyond their reach, waiting to expose the truth they were desperately trying to hide. Nina Hale opened her inbox on a quiet morning, expecting the usual stream of tips, complaints, and local announcements. Instead, she found an email with no subject, sent from an address she didn't recognize. The message contained only a short note and a link to several files. At first, she assumed it was another misleading tip, but the attached documents immediately caught her attention. They were organized, detailed, and clearly written by someone who understood medical records. The name, Arjun Varma, appeared on several notes, and as she read further, she realized the files documented a pattern of questionable injuries tied to a single deputy, Kyle Reddick. As she went through the data, Nina sensed the seriousness of what she had received. The timelines, treatment summaries, and officer names all pointed to repeated incidents of excessive force. The more she read, the heavier the information felt. It became even more disturbing when she discovered a news alert from the previous night describing the death of a medical student in a hospital parking lot. The victim's name matched the one on the files. The coincidence was too strong to ignore. To verify the information, Nina reached out to Professor Richard Vaughn, a respected pathology expert who had assisted her on past investigations. She shared the medical descriptions and asked him to analyze the type of injuries Arjun had noted and later suffered himself. After reviewing the details, Vaughn concluded that the pattern strongly suggested repeated use of force, not isolated accidents. With this confirmation, Nina realized that the files were more than notes, they were evidence that someone had died trying to expose abuse. She began drafting her story with extreme caution, knowing that releasing it could spark backlash from powerful county officials. But she also understood that staying silent would allow the truth to disappear. Arjun had taken a risk to reveal what others overlooked, and now it was up to her to ensure his findings did not vanish with him. When Nina's article was published, it spread far beyond the county within hours. The story caught the attention of national outlets, civil rights groups, and legal organizations that had been tracking similar patterns in other regions. Public pressure increased rapidly, and the sheriff's office could no longer rely on silence to protect its narrative. Questions flooded social media, demanding transparency and accountability. For the first time, the county's leadership felt the ground shift beneath them. Reddick, once considered untouchable, now found himself at the center of a growing firestorm. The turning point came when Elaine Reddick, Kyle's estranged sister, recognized her brother's name in the headlines. She had lived through years of his volatility and understood how dangerous he could be when anger took control. With the news now public, she decided to come forward. Elaine shared her own experiences with investigators, describing moments that mirrored the aggression documented in Arjun's files. Her testimony added a deeply personal layer to the case, reinforcing concerns that Reddick's behavior had been unchecked for far too long. With national attention fixed on the county, Internal Affairs launched a full investigation. Officer Ben Colton was assigned to lead the inquiry, and he approached the case with a determination that surprised many. Colton reviewed the altered reports, cross-checked timestamps, and examined surveillance records that had been marked as unusable. He discovered inconsistencies that pointed directly to intentional tampering. Several officers admitted privately that they had been pressured to support the self-defense narrative, though they were afraid to speak publicly. The evidence grew too significant to ignore. Under mounting scrutiny, the sheriff's office had no choice but to suspend Reddick. Shortly afterward, he was arrested on charges of misconduct, falsifying reports, and excessive force. What had once been a tightly controlled cover-up collapsed under the weight of the truth Arjun had quietly compiled. The deputy who once believed he could operate without consequence was now facing the consequences he had long evaded. The trial that followed was one of the most closely watched in the county's recent history. Judge Marcia Woodrow presided with careful attention, aware of the intense public scrutiny surrounding the case. From the opening day, the courtroom was filled with reporters, advocates, and families affected by police misconduct. Every detail of the prosecution's argument was painstakingly presented, relying heavily on the files Arjun had compiled, Nina Hale's reporting, and the expert analysis provided by Professor Vaughn. The evidence painted a picture that was difficult to deny. Reddick had repeatedly used excessive force, and efforts had been made to hide the truth. Witnesses came forward cautiously. Hospital staff described the fear that had gripped them, the quiet warnings, and the pressures to remain silent. Former detainees corroborated patterns of abuse, giving testimony that aligned with the injuries Arjun had documented. Elaine Reddick's account of her brother's violent tendencies added a personal, credible perspective that reinforced the prosecution's claims. Every piece of testimony chipped away at the defense's claim that the incident had been self-defense. The defense tried to cast doubt on the evidence, questioning the reliability of the documents and the journalist's role in presenting them. However, the jury could not ignore the meticulous records, the expert verification of injuries, and the overwhelming consistency of the accounts. After days of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict that reverberated through the county, guilty of manslaughter and obstruction of justice. Although Arjun never lived to see the outcome, his work had ensured accountability. The case sparked reforms in hospital reporting procedures and strengthened protections for whistleblowers, particularly students and medical trainees. Across the nation, his story became a cautionary tale about courage, integrity, and the risks of exposing wrongdoing. In the end, the young student who had quietly documented abuse had left a legacy far greater than anyone could have imagined, forcing a system to confront the truth it had tried to bury.